learning how to face our fears is a way of getting into the stream of life in a more proactive way, where life begins to kind of favor you a little bit more because you're willing to take certain calculated risks. Life is always changing. Life is transforming. We are being born, we're developing, we're growing, our clan is changing. And that change naturally provokes needs to leap into the unknown. Once we actually get over ourselves to actually face the fear, that's like the easiest part of the situation. It's a lot harder when the fear is compounding, and I'm just like, I'm feeling fearful, so I'm avoiding the situation. And because I'm avoiding it, then it's just hanging out there, or it's growing in my mind or in reality and getting worse. We're always involved in a process of becoming who we are, who we are next, right? Life doesn't stay still. And so when we are aspirational in that, when we want to become something better or improved or something we like more that's different than it is, then there's inherently a risk that's taken, where we're taking a kind of leap. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Woven Wings Live, where we bring you wisdom and tools for vibrant living. I am your host, Gabe Crane. I'm joined as always by my co-host, Rahul Deedwania. And if you enjoy listening to us, please leave us a review, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. You can follow along our newsletter, which is linked in the show description, and just share us with a friend. If you think anyone that you know of would benefit from the kinds of meaningful and depthful conversations we have on this show, send it their way, pay it forward if you've found anything valuable in what you've experienced with us. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today we are starting something a little bit different and new. We are launching a new mini-series with this episode, and we today do not have a guest. The talent is Rahul and myself. We are holding it down as your experts in training, which is funny to say, but we are going to be drawing on our own personal experience to look at this topic that we're going to be looking at over the next few episodes of facing fear, facing our fears, understanding what fear is and how can we have a healthy relationship with it in our lives to accomplish the things that we want to do in this world. And of course, we focus at Woven Wings Live on vibrant living. And as I think most of us are aware listening to this channel, fear, that we'll get into talking about, where it comes from and its benefits, and it's a natural part of life. Fear can also be a big time impediment to the experience of vibrant living. And so on that note, Rahul, I just want to welcome you here into our space together. And yeah, just curious, like, what are you freaked out about right now? What are you feeling terrified about? And just lay it all out for us. What are you scared of? No, I'm just joking. How are you feeling, dude? It's good to be with you. And what are you thinking about this topic of fear?
Likewise, good to be with you, Gabe. Thanks for that intro. And this, the first thing that came to mind as you were joking with those questions is I was like, I'm a little afraid to see where this goes. I'm like, I don't know, we're doing this for the first time. We haven't done a miniseries like this. We did that Resonant miniseries, so we have one attempt at this, and but it's also exciting. It's exciting to see where we can take this. I'm excited to go deep into a topic. Where did this topic come from, right? I think we were jumping around or tossing around a bunch of ideas, and this is one that I think is just universal, right? And fear shows up in so many different contexts and in so many different ways and at so many different intensities. There can be a underlying level of fear around something as basic as it recording our, whatever number podcast episode. There can be that real primordial fear of survival and physical danger and everything in between, right? And I think just looking at that, I think developing awareness and sort of a language around how we talk about fear. We were talking about it before, right? This isn't a purely scientific exploration of fear or anything like that, but even anecdotally, right? Like, what is it? What happens? What is happening scientifically, but also what happens for us experientially? Can we become more and more attuned to when we feel fear, and then from that place start to relate to it in a different way, right? And whether it's embracing it, whether it's learning how to sidestep it, whether it's learning how to overcome it, and then on the other side, it's what you were saying, right, Gabe? Like, can that open the door to us living a more expansive, vibrant life? And yeah, I just think this is always topical, and I'm excited to go into it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've had a couple episodes recently that have started to touch on this topic, and I think that created some of our inspiration. Thinking about having Rosie on, whatever, like a month
Yeah,
ago or so, and talking about the inner critic. And so, if you're interested in kind of getting a primer on this topic or looking at it from that angle, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to Rosie's episode with us, which is just excellent. I mean, she just
I don't
brought
know.
so
I
much
personally think
wonderful
Rahul is
exploration. But
not
I think
that
the
great.
idea here is that today it's just Rahul and I, but in the subsequent weeks, we are going to be bringing on some different experts and different perspectives for us to be able to look at this topic in more depth together. But before we do so, I think we wanted to set up today specifically for kind of what you were just discussing, Rahul, of like, what is the fear that we feel, like just being here, right? And I think we try to do that. If you listen to our show for some time, that this is not an abstract kind of conversation, right? This is more of an experiential interaction. We are trying to model for you all, and it's growthful for us personally to actually deal live with the topics that we are discussing. And you brought that up, Rahul, about like the fear you feel about doing this very episode, and I share that. Um, and I guess I'm curious if you want to ping pong about that a little bit more. If you could go into a bit more depth. I know I have like all sorts of different thoughts about fear as it relates to this project specifically, Woven Wings Live, like, and the fact that here we are, like 2.5 years or whatever into our process and doing it. Um, there's a lot to learn from that, I think, because I mean, I've felt scared, lost, really confused about what we're doing or why we're doing it at all sorts of different times. And I guess would probably show up as on the surface. I might label that as different things, like feeling creatively stumped, or I'm feeling like ashamed or something. Or but if I boil all those things down, probably to like a fundamental root, fear is probably common to all of them. And I think we have had to face our fears in just getting to this point. And so there's some sort of process that's been valuable there. Um, and here we are trying to do it again. And whether we'll be able to, I don't know. But yeah, I'm just curious if you want to elaborate on that thought a little bit more.
Yeah, what you were just saying actually got me thinking about how there's always like a new frontier to fear. I think back to our first episode, and there were all sorts of different kinds of emotions at play, right? Nerves, anxiety, but fear was a big one. Like, how's it going to sound? Are we going to look? Is it going to make any sense? And I think we've since moved past some of those basal fears just around doing the project in some ways. But then the frontier moves. Right now, it's like, hey, is it going to be a good product? Are people going to find it valuable? Is anyone actually going to take us up on the invitation to share it with a friend? And as I think about it, for me, I think a lot of it comes back to this idea of fear of failure. And it's such a like funny concept if you think about it. Like, I think fear in some ways, when I think about it, is like this primal emotion, right? There's some sort of a threat, there's some sort of a danger. The emotion of fear is meant to activate us, right, into some sort of a response, fight, or fight or flight, of course, is the common framework. Um, but whatever it might be, right? Some reaction to get us to act in response to a threat or danger. And I think about when I've felt that kind of fear before, when I felt like I was going to fall off a narrow ledge, or one time I was here in San Francisco and like 15 feet away from a shooting, and like just remembering like hearing the sound, seeing it happen. And there was this like deep primal reaction of fear. And then you look at something like what we're talking about, and it almost feels made up, right? It's like, what does it mean to fear failure for a elective project that we enjoy doing, that we've put ourselves into? And yet it is real, right? There is this fear of putting something out there, looking stupid, maybe losing a sense of belonging, losing a sense of esteem or respect, from people who are engaging with what we're putting out there. And there's a fear associated with that, right? Or a fear of even looking at it and not being proud of it, and I don't know how to couch what those things are, right? Like it feels both made up and artificial and very real. I'm sure very relatable to people listening to this. Both at the same time. I'm
Yeah.
curious what you think about all that.
Well, I think that there is a process of becoming, right? We're always involved in a process of becoming who we are, who we are next, right? Life doesn't stay still. And so when we are aspirational in that, when we want to become something better or improved or something we like more that's different than it is, then there's inherently a risk that's taken, where we're taking a kind of leap into that unknown. And I'm pretty sure that everyone listening to this, and I know it's true for me, is just anytime there's anything new involved, there's going to be that voice of fear and resistance. And it's interesting what you're saying about it being made up, because I'm probably not definitely not the total expert to talk about this, but if we just understand some baselines around the way that fear works within our nervous system, and that we have that physiological nervous system response you were describing to being in threatening situations, right? And that activates our amygdala. As you said, we get put into a fight flight, and there's also freeze, fawn. They keep adding
Yep.
F's now to this
Yep.
to this area. But we have these fear responses, which is like essentially that we are tight, right? Our system tightens up, and we go into a survival mindset. But because of the way that we've evolved, humans, we are extremely social creatures, right? Like our brains are the size that they are primarily because of our ability for social functioning and processing all the complex relationships that are involved in being part of a 120 person, give or take, clan, and all the different dynamics and relationships that are involved there. And that shows the layer to which social um, success is really wired into our experience. It is adjacent. It's not the same as physiological death, like success or failure, but it feels the same way in our minds, right? We experience it as these life or death things to be validated in society or by our community, or to be rejected, and unfortunately I think you see that a lot when people feel like a failure. Then it can lead to all sorts of unfortunate outcomes,
Yeah.
and so it becomes real. So that social experience is very real. And um and we have to figure out ways around that if we want to experience some sort of autonomy or some sort of success, right? Because all of that brain development and chemistry that put us into the position to be able to relate to and facilitate relationships within that clan, those are also the things that really limit us, right? Because that's where we get our groupthink mindset. That's where we don't want to step out of line and do our own thing, because the 20 other people in our clan are going to see that as an affront to the norms of the clan, and not be part of that anymore, and that's risky. We could be rejected, we could be betrayed. And so there's that tension there. We evolved these abilities to do this for good reason, because we can do more stuff within a collective, But then that collective also limits us from doing the things that we are most excited and inspired to reach for.
Yeah, and the way that I think about some of that too is the social component and finding social belonging and cohesion is contributing to our sense of security, right? So when we talk about the physical danger, right? What is the physical danger triggering in us? It's a feeling that our security is at risk, right? That something might happen to us. And I think to your point, it's a very similar physiological experience, maybe not to the same degree, when we feel like our security is challenged by loss of social standing, right? It's like, why is fear of public speaking, right? Like the number one fear, right? And it's like, oh, because you're going to go up there and lose social standing and then lose uh, that sense of security that comes with, like you said, belonging to that clan, feeling like the clan has your back versus feeling like you're an outcast. And I imagine, again, not an expert on this, but I think the brain then is taking it many steps forward, right? Oh, I don't have social support. Oh, I'm going to be out in the wild on my own. And that's scary, and you mentioned uncertainty, right? Uncertainty is common to most situations, I feel, where fear shows up, or at least what I think of when I think of fear showing up. And so much of uncertainty nowadays shows up in the context of, a new work endeavor, a new frontier where, it's something like work or in family or in a relationship where maybe there was some tension. It's like, how's it going to play out? And all of those things that come with uncertainty, I think trigger that same fear response alongside, a number of other emotional responses and send us into that state that you were talking about.
Right. Right. And so then why is it important, right, that we understand this and look at it? Like, why should we face our fears? It's like there's some part of me there that's just like, oh, well, it would just be really nice if I just didn't have to. And I why can't I just feel secure and, in my bubble all the time? But we all know that that's not really how life works, right? If you life is always changing, life is transforming. We are being born, we're developing, we're growing, our clan is changing, and that change naturally provokes needs to leap into the unknown. And it's interesting to like feel that voice of like that wants the comfort and just would like to just never have to feel fear. But then on the flip side, you're talking about the unknown. Last week when we were recording with Mark, you were talking, Rahul, a lot about creativity and improv, and that's also what's happening in the unknown, right? The the fear is accompanying the opportunity for some sort of creative process, something
Yeah.
unexpected to leap forward. And I think when we talk about vibrancy on this show, or what does it mean to be vibrantly living, think part of that is the embrace of that, right? Like the showing up, the being present for like, I have no idea what's going to really happen today, and in this moment, but I'm here. I'm not following like a set rote program. I'm not hiding from it, but like I'm here for the unexpected. I'm here to be stimulated by that, entertained by that in a certain way, and to contribute something positive towards it.
Yeah, and that's it, right? That's exactly it. I think if if we, and I think it sometimes can be hard to internalize that first assumption that you put out there, and not even assumption, just basic foundational truth, which is that fear is always going to be present, right? This idea of becoming fearless or being fearless, is sort of a myth, right? You hear it from the the people in the world that are branded as fearless. You hear interviews with them, right? I often go back to this interview, one of my favorites of Kobe Bryant, who often is, oh, he's this guy with a killer mentality, never has fear, and he's talking about how he faces fear, and fear is present, and it's just a matter of learning how to deal with it, right, and to coexist with it. And I think that 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 what's it called, internalization, right, of, hey, this is a reality, things are changing, fear is always going to be present. I think that's so important to start with, and then to get to a place where we can view that reality in a positive way or as like an opportunity, like you said, I think that's like a superpower, right? If we can really unlock that for ourselves, and I hope to be tapping into that, and really orienting around that as we go into this mini series. But that's exciting, right? It's exciting to be like, hey, there's a world in which I can feel fear, but alongside it, hopefully at least equally, and if not in greater quantity, also feel excitement, right? And opportunity and a possibility of creativity and creation. And I think for all of that to coexist is actually beautiful, right? And then we can lean into our fears and use our fears even to channel it in a direction that is meaningful and vibrant and
Right.
attractive to us.
Right. Well, yeah. Where it's what I hear you saying is that fear becomes a signal for opportunity,
Yeah.
versus the indication that we should be slinking away, but it's if we can catch ourselves in that moment where we say, oh, I'm freaked out right now, that must mean there's something interesting here, that something must be taking place right now that indicates that there's like real change or real potential, real possibility. And if I can tune into that, then maybe I can open up to what's available here a little bit more.
Or
And
there's a threat, or there's a
yeah,
threat
yeah,
that
yeah,
has to
right.
be dealt with. It could be that, but it's a signal. It's a useful signal, I think, is what we're saying.
Right, 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 right. And I like that you brought that in, right? Because I think we have to differentiate and hold both of those sides in this conversation that, there are times when there are legitimate threats. This is not just, I think sometimes you get into kind of like a self-improvement kind of conversation and you're like, oh, just
Yeah.
just overcome your fears and just all of that. And it's just like, well, yeah, but like sometimes it is time to run away from the bear, or like you like, no, it's like this is legitimately a situation where you should be freaked out. You should be changing something about that, and I think that's equally true, to what we're discussing here. But alongside that is the reality as well that so much of our fears are kind of biologically misplaced. We're applying our fear into areas that essentially create limitation and unfortunate loss in our life of possibilities, because we're too scared to experience the life that's potentially available if we're willing to take that risk.
Yeah, and just because it came to me right now, I'll throw in another version of threat that I think is interesting, um, and actually productive. I would say, like, there's a specific idea of like I think like I can have a fear of conflict, and sometimes that fear, even though I feel generally good handling conflict, but sometimes I'll feel that fear before a like particular conflict has taken place. And that's
Totally.
a to me a useful threat signal as well. Kind of like, oh, looks like something is about to blow up. There's this tinderbox, there's this underlying tension, and and it's been helpful for me, I would say, at different stages of life and different contexts to recognize that fear and then basically to have some sort of early intervention, to ease the scenario or the circumstances that could otherwise lead to something much more explosive. I'm sure that that threat signal misfires, or maybe it puts me in a threatened state more often than it should. I'm sure that's some stuff I have to unpack in therapy or something like that. But at the same time, like it's very helpful. It's very helpful to be able to sense some of these things, I think.
Yeah. Well, again, like, so we were talking about unknown and fear, and then I think what it also brings up, what you just shared, is control. And that when we do feel fearful, then as the opposite of that is having control of the situation, and being able to manage or eliminate, ideally, all the uncertainties, and then we don't have to feel fear. Um, but I think within that, then we lose again the creative possibility of what's also there. And so I think it, there's so many different sayings out there of fear. I mean, I'm sure if you're listening to this, you can think of so many different sayings and cliches and stuff. But some of the ones that have stuck out to me since we started talking here, is like, one is that fortune favors the bold, that learning how to face our fears is a way of getting into the stream of life in a more proactive way, where life begins to kind of favor you a little bit more because you're willing to take certain calculated risks. Um, the other thing that comes to my mind is I think that's FDR, right? The only thing to fear is fear itself. Or what I often take from that is that, when I'm feeling scared, it usually compounds on itself. Like, I just feel like I'm scared, and then I'm scared about feeling scared. Or is your
Yeah.
example of the conflict made me think about that? Because I used to do a lot of conflict mediation work, and in a variety of contexts. I was like, I hate dealing with it. Like I
Yeah.
was like, oh man, like, why did I sign up for this? Like, now I have to deal with these people who don't like each other, or I'm in an argument. It's like, and there's all this resistance to going into dealing with it and facing the situation. Once I face it, once I get into it, and I won't like sugarcoat it, because I've been in a lot of situations that like were not that pleasant once I was in it, actually. But as a general principle, I would say that once we actually get over ourselves to actually face the fear, that's like the easiest part of the situation. It's a lot harder when the fear is compounding, and I'm just like,
Yeah.
I'm feeling fearful, so I'm avoiding the situation. And because I'm avoiding it, then it's just hanging out there, or it's growing in my mind or in reality and getting worse. And so, I think a big part of this is figuring out how to identify again when we are feeling that way, so that we can respond differently or take it as a signal, as you were describing.
Yeah, and I think, and what you were saying, this idea of fortune favors the bold, right? It's just so important. It keeps coming back to why we're looking at this topic. And I'm thinking about, even in my own experience, let's just say, just to couch it a little bit, even in being a coach, right? And at times there's this contraction, this fear of like, oh, maybe I'm going to say something that is off base, or maybe I'm going to say something that is taken in a way that's negative, right? And that fear is holding back possibility, right? And if I think about kind of where I want to be, and many times I am, and many times I'm not, right? It's that person that can, like you said, take calculated, well-intentioned risks, right? That are like seeing the fear, but being comfortable overcoming it, right? And I think since they're throwing out cliche quotes, right? It's like you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? And
Right.
not taking shots due to fear is something that can really hold back so many different arenas of life, right? I think back to like dating, in the early days, right? Like prior to meeting Kirti, and just like approaching somebody, right? And it's like, oh, everyone wants to be in a frame of mind where that's not as uncomfortable an interaction or moment as it ends up being, right? Or, I was reading about some child development stuff. It's like that moment when a kid is thinking about joining a group that's already playing. Like they're like, oh, how do I
Mm,
enter? Right.
yeah.
That
Yeah.
apparently is like a really, really formative moment that, and what feedback they receive in terms of how they approach it, especially early on, can have like big impact apparently on like how they start viewing those situations in the future. And it's like all that stuff is so, so interesting to me, right? Because underlying all of it is fear, right? And if we can, like you said, become aware, if we can notice, if we can get to a point where it's not holding us back from taking some of these chances, so much possibilities on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I want to invite folks who are listening to this to just take a minute, I'm going to take us through like our version of it, or our example, but just take a minute to think intuitively for about, what are you scared about right now? What is kind of freaking you out in your landscape? And probably the things that kind of bubble up before your like rational mind gets to edit them is probably like the most like alive things, um, because these things show up like across the board. I mean, if I use myself as an example, like you mentioned dating, Rahul, or you mentioned children. I think about like my son and like how am I doing as a dad? How's his development going? I think about my situations professionally, all sorts of different layers. I think what's valuable and instructive maybe here as you're thinking about that, if you're listening to us, is just we touched on this earlier, Rahul, but like looking at this project, for example, our podcast, you know, we've had a lot of fear. I know for both of us because we've talked about it. I'll speak for myself personally. So much fear has come up around this project that, in retrospect, is dumb to use Mark's language, from last time. It's like it doesn't make any sense rationally. If you look back, it's like what you're saying is 100% accurate. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So just get out and make a podcast. And like at first, no one's going to listen to it anyways. So just record whatever you feel like and post it. But how much, like, pulling teeth, man, like so much effort personally to get to a place where I'm like, okay, yeah, like set up the time, press record, do the like not that intense but logistical administrative steps to get to a place where you can actually do that, and then like put it out there, and along the way, all the different voices of criticism, which are expressions of fear, coming along the way of like, this is not good, or what will we do next? But where it's now come to a point, I feel like what we've been doing more recently is we've been actively courting fear. And we haven't used that language to describe
Yeah.
it, but I think that's what we're doing because we've kind of got to places. We talked about this last week on Mark's episode, where it's like we are now in a rhythm and groove with doing this. We have a routine, we have a system, and that takes some of the excitement out of it. Might make it more of a professional product, but there's something that is alive and creative that's lacking when it becomes rote, and becomes
Yeah.
dead. And so now here we are actually like upping the fear factor by like planning less, of just saying like, okay, well, let's actually surprise ourselves on air and see what actually comes out, and not have a whole script and a whole game plan and doing more prep that would put us in that place. And let's take that leap of faith to kind of see what emerges. And so I just think that journey is really interesting because when I look back on it, I'm like, oh, well, this podcast, I'll speak for myself personally, it's pretty crucial and core to what I value and believe in my life, and I'm working to develop professionally in my life. So like it's a huge benefit that like we've been doing this for the last 2.5 years. Because if I hadn't been, I would be in the same place of wanting to do certain things that I'm doing right now through Woven Wings, through my business, but without the 2.5 years of shot taking, without that podcast, looking at starting it from scratch. And so, the best time to have planted a tree was 10 years ago, right? And the second best
Yeah.
time is right now, today. Um, so yeah, so I don't know. I track like how much resistance and everything is involved in my process to get to that. And I know that, for all of us, it's like that relates to so many different experiences of what we might want out of life, but feel held back by.
Yeah, and it's funny, right? Like one of the the big things around fear is that it's rarely as bad as we think it'll be, right? And I'm thinking about or the downside, even the worst case scenario that we imagine in our heads is like one, not likely to happen in almost like all cases. And then even if it does, it's like probably not going to be that bad, right? And again, getting out of the realm of not including the realm of physical danger, physical threats, that kind of thing. But I often remember reading, I think it was Tim Ferriss had this idea of fear setting, which is like just take the situations that where you're feeling fear and just like put down like what is the worst case scenario, what is the like absolute worst case scenario? And then imagine you're there. And I forget whether like two or three questions basically, but some version of like, imagine you're there. what would happen if it happened, or what is something you could do to like mitigate that outcome. So I think that
Mm,
was actually a preventative step. Then it's like, all right, let's just say you weren't able to prevent it, what would actually happen, right? And that's just a way of trying to like define fear, because I think fear also has this like ephemeral quality to it, because it is that kind of, amygdala driven base, what's it called, limbic system reaction in your brain. And it's like, oh, if you actually bridge it over to your rational brain and start to define it, often you're able to see it as something not that significant. But when you're in that fear state, almost by design, you don't, it shuts off that part of your brain, right? It's you're in the fear versus analyzing the fear. And that part of it I find always very interesting, right? All under this umbrella of recognizing that the fear is rarely warranted to the degree that we feel it.
hmm Yeah, and you touched on this at the top of the show, but it's like what's on the other side of that fear experience is flow, is the experience of love, of of meaning, of connection, possibility, profundity. All of that lives, beyond the realms of constriction and tension and fear, and it encapsulates them too. I mean, it's part of the totality of life there, but that's what we want, right? We're all seeking that on some level. It's hard, it's painful to live in a fearful state, and it's a part of life. So we're not sidestepping it, but I think all of us want to experience a sense of flow, positivity, energy, moving in our life. So I think that's what's at stake. I mean, and I feel that you've been an entrepreneur, Rahul. I feel that running my own business, like that's what's at stake, right? Um, is like what kind of life am I going to live? Like here's my chance. Am I going to live today small and like and I have plenty of days like that, where I'm just like I'm just
Yeah.
don't feel good or I'm scared, but there's a rhythm where it's like okay, like my soul naturally it wants to transcend, it wants to break through that barrier, and if it doesn't, it's disappointed, it is it's refined, it cannot not refined, sorry, it's blocked, and it wants to evolve, it wants to get over that hurdle. And yeah, I think one last thing I'll mention, we'll get into a lot more strategies and kind of suggestions, I think, as we unfold this mini series. But one thing I'll just shout out to you, man, as part of this, and for folks to think about at home, is that having supportive community, having somebody to share your fear with, having someone to work through the process and say, hey, let's do this together, can be very powerful. And I
Yeah.
think I know that our project has succeeded to the extent that it has, much more than I would have probably on my own, because where I was at on my own is I probably wouldn't have had the wherewithal and the self-awareness and the resilience and the strength to be like, yeah, like I'm doing this regularly every 2 weeks, no matter how I feel, but you and me having that accountability together, having that reflection together has made so much more possible.
Yeah, I know, I fully echo that. And I think, I want to invite our listeners again to back to themselves, right? If you're still here with us and you answered that first question in your mind, right, of what are you afraid of right now? The next question I'd pose to you is what Gabe was just talking about, right? Which is what's possible on the other side of that fear, right? What would it look like to not honor that fear, let that fear hold you back, right? And what's possible? And for us, right, it's been this creative process. Again, continuing to use this project. I mean, I had been thinking about, starting a podcast for a long time. You had been thinking about starting it for a long time, and I think we found security, right, in doing it together, and in comfort and doing it together and pushing the boundaries as we have been. So, I'm just excited, Gabe, to be going into this topic. Again, for those that are here, those that are with us, right? I think what we hope to explore is the science of fear, the experience of fear, what's actually happening. We've alluded to it a couple of times and, in broad strokes today, but what is fear, right? What is actually happening for us physiologically? What are examples of events, right, that have instilled fear broadly, right? We're not too far out of a pandemic. We're seeing wars around the world. What are those types of events that have created an underlying foundation or basis of fear in society at large? How do we see fear in the world, in terms of the media, in terms of art, in terms of how fear shows up at work? These are all different crevices that we might jump into and explore. Then, of course, really wanting to go deep on facing fear, right? How do we cope with it? How do we overcome it? Where do we find courage? Where do we find resilience? How do we build awareness? How do we actually use fear as a tool? Artists, right? That is one specific group we're interested in. Artists that use fear as a muse, use it to inspire. And we've talked a little bit about that today as well. So lots of different places, I think we can take this, and, I'm looking forward to seeing what emerges.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So, um, yeah, hopefully you can take Rahul up on his suggestion of thinking about what's on the other side. And his one last thing is just if this is moving some things inside you, maybe think about who is around that you might like to share that experience with, or maybe share this episode with, and say, "Hey, listen to this. Why don't we be accountability buddies and listen to this and see kind of how fear is moving in our lives and how things could transform." So that's some stuff to think about between now and next time. We'll look forward to getting creative, facing our own fears, and coming up with some cool content to share with y'all around this topic. And stay tuned for that to come up next time. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you all for joining in with us today. We have a little bit shorter episode today, just to kind of keep it simple and lay out, kind of where we're headed. But I hope this is awesome and valuable for you all, and that it gets you started on thinking about up leveling in life, transforming your own experience with fear, and stepping out and being more and more of the out loud, inspired, living example of a vibrantly alive person that we need so much of in this world. And so, thanks so much for tuning in with us. It's really great to be with you all as always. Again, you can subscribe, check us out on YouTube, subscribe to our newsletter, and share our work with that accountability buddy that you've got. So with that said, we will catch you next time. Thanks for joining us, and see you out there.